Hello everyone, now you will hear a brief retelling of the movie Between Heaven and Earth. Enjoy the movie. Elizabeth is an intern who spends all her time working. She practically does not sleep in order to have time to help the maximum number of patients. Her co-workers have relationships, get married, raise children. Unlike her, they have personal lives. Elizabeth is lucky. Nothing to worry about but work. Oh yes! Elizabeth is the complete opposite of her sister Abby, a housewife and mother of 2 daughters. The woman is going to set her sister up with a guy, an acquaintance of her acquaintance. In the meantime, Elizabeth is making progress on the professional front. The chief doctor informs the girl that she is accepted into the staff of the hospital. The boss asks Elizabeth to finally go home and rest because she has been on shift for 26 hours. The girl has already changed her clothes and was going into the elevator, but she was stopped by a nurse who was not sure of the patient's diagnosis. Elizabeth just couldn't refuse. This made her late for dinner at her sister's, just like that guy. Overworked and facing bad weather, Elizabeth missed seeing the truck ahead and had an accident. We meet David, the second character, searching for a suitable apartment, but each option is stranger than the last. The realtor had nothing sensible to offer. Then an ad for an apartment rental was blown to David's feet by the wind. He flipped the piece of paper off first, but it persistently clung to him again. It was probably fate. Finally, David found himself in an apartment with a normal interior. But there's one peculiarity. The apartment is only rented on a month-to-month renewable basis. Why, the realtor doesn't know. The relatives do not want to talk about it. Most of all, David was interested in the sofa. After all, he is going to spend all his free time on it. David spends his evenings stuck in front of the TV, pounding beers. Suddenly, he bumps into Elizabeth in the kitchen. She mistook him for a fence or a homeless person, as she's the one renting the apartment. Elizabeth had fully furnished it and was pained to see what kind of slob had moved in. She headed to the kitchen to grab a rag and a bucket, then vanished as quickly as she had appeared. To prevent this from happening again, David decided to install an additional lock. However, the lady reappeared, if only for a brief moment. David shared with his friend Jack about this mysterious visitor. Indeed, he was intoxicated at the time, yet he had never encountered this bothersome blonde before. Jack, being a psychologist, offers him advice on how to return to normalcy and cease his investigations. 2 years prior, David experienced a traumatic event that disrupted his life. Now he is anxious that the blonde might unexpectedly emerge at any given moment. The lady appeared while David was asleep. "How did you get in here? You're the one who climbed in here." Elizabeth concluded that this uninvited guest must be a lunatic who mistakenly believed he had rented the apartment in question. After all, she knew all the details about this place and could easily prove her claim. Elizabeth noticed that her picture was missing from the nightstand. She was indignant and decided she should call the police after all, but strangely her hand went right through the phone for some reason. The girl was taken aback and went to the phone located in the kitchen, and David did not see her again that day. The man reached out to the realtor to gather information about who lived in the apartment prior to him. The girl's family refuses to discuss it. She is likely deceased. Feeling unsettled, David decided to read up on the afterlife. The salesman, Daryl, was informed and suggested a few books. Later in the evening, David attempted to summon the spirit of his neighbor. However, Elizabeth appeared only when David was about to place a dirty cup on her expensive desk. It was the moment for him to start asking questions. Yet the girl couldn't even recall her own name. Additionally, she was unaware of what she does when she's not at home. David suggests to Elizabeth that she's not a lifer anymore. He implies she should perhaps take a look around, notice the bright light, and finally ascend to heaven. The girl didn't realize how she ended up in the center of the table. "What's wrong with me? You're dead." "Stop calling me those names." Elizabeth wanted to throw the man out, but she ended up falling out of the window herself. "Rest in peace. I'm not going anywhere without you." Now, the ghost is haunting David throughout the entire apartment. She criticizes him for his drinking habits and won't allow him to watch TV, loudly singing some song. David's nerves finally gave out, and he called a priest to exorcise the demon from his apartment. However, the Chinese rituals didn't have any effect. It's quite similar with ghost hunters. They merely pretended to capture the spirit within a pyramid. This left just one final option. So David decided to invite Daryl over, and indeed, he was correct. The boy could sense Elizabeth's presence and even feel her hostility. He advises David to move out of the house, but instead, David wants the girl to go toward the light. However, she doesn't see any light. Daryl had a feeling that this spirit is unusually alive, almost as if the girl herself is still living. By the way, David possesses an extremely dark aura, as he struggles to remove his ex from his heart. It's true, she didn't leave David, contrary to Elizabeth's joke. His wife had passed away. The ghost apologized, and a furious David headed to the bar. Elizabeth arrived at the establishment with her neighbor and forbade him from getting drunk. The girl harassed David, making him twitch and talk to himself. To stop the widower from tossing a glass of whiskey, the spirit possessed him and started controlling his body. A very distraught man came into the park, and Elizabeth was left wondering what had happened to her, and why it seemed that only David could see her. When he's not around, it's almost as if she doesn't exist. Elizabeth can't recall who she is or who she used to be. And there's no one except David to help her figure it all out. The man went around to all the neighbors, but nobody really knows who used to live in his apartment. Only one girl remembers the unsociable blonde. She started flirting with David, but he swiftly ran away from her. David then asks Elizabeth to please not follow him. She's like a persistent radio he just can't turn off. The widower was on the verge of getting drunk once more, but suddenly, the widower discovers a clue. It's a receipt from the dry cleaner. The employee recalls Elizabeth as a nice yet moody girl, who seemed to be filled with loneliness and longing. Elizabeth remembers that she had wanted to go to a restaurant, but she just couldn't find the time. All of a sudden, one of the guests starts feeling really sick. Nobody knows how to help him with first aid except for Elizabeth. She instructs David on the steps he needs to take, and all he has to do is make a careful incision between the man's ribs. After David stabs the unfortunate man with a knife, he inserts a pipette into the wound, allowing the man to breathe once more. Elizabeth guessed she had worked as a doctor, and the name of the closest hospital sounded familiar to her. The receptionist directed David to speak with Dr. Fran. The man lied about them dating Elizabeth, but Fran finds it hard to believe because the intern was so dedicated to her job. It's even stranger that he knows nothing about the accident. It's been 3 months since it happened. Elizabeth hurried down the hallway and found the room where she is lying. The girl has been in a coma for 3 months now. David was relieved. His roommate wasn't dead after all. However, there's not much good news here either. 3 months is a very deep coma. Elizabeth tries to put her soul back into her body, but nothing works. David took Elizabeth's hand and she felt a tingling sensation, so the connection to the body is still intact. In the room, the picture Elizabeth was looking for was on the windowsill. It's time for David to go home. He calls the girl to come with him, but she stays. Her place is here now. Another intern has taken Elizabeth's place as doctor, and Brett doesn't give a crap about the patients, unlike her. Elizabeth noticed her nieces, but somehow she can't seem to feel their touch. Her sister also doesn't see her. Brett guides Abby out into the hallway and explains Elizabeth's opposition to artificial life extension. Elizabeth had signed a waiver, yet this situation is unique. Without her sister's consent, they are unable to shut it down. Elizabeth's opinion has changed significantly, and she sincerely hopes that Abby chooses not to sign anything. David felt sad again, but he didn't drink and used the cup holder. His neighbor Katrina visited, saying her door slammed, and she waits for a locksmith. The lively lady promotes herself, but David's thoughts are elsewhere. Then Elizabeth returns, saying she might soon be disconnected, needing his help. Katrina was already calling David into the bedroom, saying, "Come here, I want to show you something." If it was obvious, why prolong it? Elizabeth peeked into the room through the door and noticed a tattoo on Katrina's rear that said, "All aboard." The girl left the room, and Elizabeth started to urge David to take action quickly. She wouldn't stop him. However, David chose to go to Elizabeth on the roof instead. He explained to his friend how, during the argument, his wife suddenly clutched her head and collapsed. It was a brain hemorrhage. He didn't even get to say goodbye to her. Elizabeth recognizes that even if Abby doesn't sign the papers, it won't change anything. Her brain activity was decreasing every day. David decided to prove that he wasn't always such a moody boo. He worked as a landscape architect. He even had his own firm, and Elizabeth had always dreamed of having a garden of her own. David promised her that he would definitely get back to creating such beauty. All of a sudden, David received a call from the realtor, letting him know that the apartment owners were finally prepared to enter into a long-term contract. The man realized it was crucial to speak with Elizabeth's sister. However, for Abby to trust David, he needed to uncover a secret about her that only he and her sister were aware of. Elizabeth recalls that her sister kissed her ex-boyfriend just 5 minutes before the wedding. David then deceives Abby by claiming he was once a patient of Elizabeth's. The girl herself suspects that her niece, Lily, also sees her. David pleads with the woman to give his sister just a little more time. Unfortunately, it was too late. She had already signed the papers. The system was going to be shut down the next day. David realized there was nothing left to lose, so he began talking about how Elizabeth is with them now, and he is the only one who can see her. Abby went along with it and took the kids to their room. Then she grabbed an axe and ordered the psycho to get the hell out of there. "I'll cut you. I swear I'll cut you." Then David reminded her of the incidents at the wedding, and the woman's mind was completely blown. She chased the weirdo away and looked in on her daughters. "How are you kids? Mommy, does Aunt Elizabeth want more tea? What?" David wasn't going to give up, so he went to Daryl for help again, and he sensed that the ghost had fallen in love with a man. Daryl assumed that Elizabeth was prevented from returning to her body by some unfinished business. He also needed to understand why David felt such a strong connection to her. Elizabeth came across a photograph of herself. David had taken it from the hospital, fearing he might never have the chance to see the girl again. On the day the photo was taken, Elizabeth had failed her entrance exam. Despite this, she didn't mourn at that moment and instead went out to celebrate with her sister at a bar, having more fun than she ever had before. But how did Elizabeth spend all the years that followed? She couldn't recall anything except her work, and she was putting off living her life until later. Who could have known that there might not be a later? However, she's grateful to have spent her last day with David, if only he could still hold her. "I believe I understand what's holding me here." David awoke in bed by himself. He feared Elizabeth was practically sitting beside him. The man pondered his next move. He planned to take Elizabeth's body and gain a bit more time for himself. David decided to take Jack on as his assistant, but he didn't reveal what their tasks would involve. It was in the hospital where he confessed everything. Jack listened attentively and suggested accompanying him to the psychiatric ward, but David was resistant. Well, if the ghost is lurking behind him, it would signal Jack to indicate with his hand. "Is it the rock again?" "He gave me the fook." "You gave her a fook?" David admits that he would do absolutely anything to save Elizabeth. Because he truly loves her. No one has ever told the girl that before. The entire company gathered into the ward. And then Jack recognized Elizabeth. 3 months ago, he had set up a date that David never appeared for. And this girl was involved in a car accident. That's the reason he's visiting her. They were destined to meet. Also, Jack is Abby's ex, the one she kissed just before the wedding. Brad was on the verge of entering the room. David emerged and, with Elizabeth's assistance, started to deceive him. However, when the conversation reached a standstill, he simply knocked him out. The security team chased the intruders. Jack confronted one of them. Sadly, he still held his breathing tube in his hand, which signifies it's all over. Elizabeth started to fade away. David hurried to her and kissed her lips. The pervert was quickly restrained by the guards. But all of a sudden, Elizabeth showed a pulse. She regained consciousness. Yet she doesn't remember David and refuses to let him touch her hand. The man found himself with no other option but to leave. She couldn't recall Daryl either. After some time had passed, Elizabeth went back to her home. The girl couldn't shake off the feeling that something important was missing there. Elizabeth settled down on the couch and noticed a cup mark on the table. She glanced around and stepped out onto the rooftop. There, David had created a stunning garden, just the kind Elizabeth had always dreamed about. To avoid startling the girl, David said his farewells and was about to depart when Elizabeth asked him to give back the key. Their touch made her remember it all. It wasn't a dream. They kissed.